training, a similar picture, right? 89% of the population with no formal qualification. Very small vocational education and training system. You see excess capacity because people don't want to go, because the unemployment rates of the job, of those who attend, are so high. And the urgency to reform of this whole system is magnified by the demographic, either dividend or challenge that India faces. The fact that you have the world's largest young population, and that if the country can't figure out a way to give them educational opportunity, there's likely to be major consequences, both socially and politically. Now, this is a huge contrast with most of the rest of the world. As you may know, Japan is already shrinking. South Korea is going to nearly disappear at its current birth rate. Large parts of Northern Europe are also declining. And so if India can get it right, and if we emerge from this economic crisis, there are huge opportunities for that workforce because other nations will need talent. They are not producing it themselves. People are just not having enough kids. So other than the US or Australia, right, at Korea it's 1.3. Right? So you have very, very low population. Japan will shrink by half by 2050. And they have no openness to immigration. So the way that US, Australia, Canada deals with open their doors, Japan in this recession, they kicked out the few immigrants they had. They paid them to go back to Brazil because they didn't want them to take jobs from the native Japanese. So there are huge opportunities, but also huge challenges for reform. Thank you. I think that the timing for this project is really ideal because you have at the top of the country, in your leadership, a huge commitment to changing the system. The Prime Minister has identified a skills mission to try to provide skills to that large group of unqualified by 2022 to train over 500 million people. No country in the history of the planet has ever tried to do this effectively. It's a huge challenge for the system, but a vital one that needs to be met. Likewise, in your new HRD minister, Kapil Sibal, you have someone who already, in a very brief time, is stirring up the system, has an aggressive 100-day reform agenda, is looking to take on some of the entrenched interests. The question will be, with this ambitious bill to provide education as a right, with all of the different reform proposals, will these actually get through the system and be implemented? Unfortunately, every generation's past efforts to do this have not met with great success. So in the 60s, in the 80s, you saw similarly ambitious skills agendas, but they didn't take hold, and the problems have persisted. Will today be different? That, I think, will be the interesting challenge. So, to conclude, we want to just look briefly at India's skills future. What are the options that we see? Well, I would argue that what we need is a distinctive Indian solution, not to borrow something directly from the US or Britain, to study the best systems around the world, but then to adapt that to the Indian context. And I think there are many elements from India's own history that can be built on. So James Tooley, professor from Newcastle in the UK, has documented that actually, before the British Raj, before the British came, most villages had schools. They were paid for by the citizens there. The government was not involved. They were providing education, not universal, but it existed. And that system was largely destroyed by what the British brought. Can something like that, with real local accountability and ownership, be built again? Likewise, the founder of the nation, Gandhi's educational philosophy was to integrate basic education and training with a relevant skill, to try to come up with ways that people could learn while doing, and that this system could be self-sustaining by the work that was produced. That model, I think, has great potential for thinking about the expansion of vocational education and training. India's philanthropists, the Tatas, the Jindals, the other groups, have played a huge role in creating some of the leading higher education institutions in India's past. The question is now, will the new wealth, can that be channeled to invest back and build leading institutions in the future? And likewise, when the IITs and the IIMs were created, they reached out to the best nations around the world and said, partner with us. Help us to create these as world-class institutions, and it worked. Can we do something similar again today? The situation is very different. India now has institutions like your own, the IITs, the IIMs. It doesn't need as much or the same kind of help from abroad, but leading universities around the world are interested in India if the framework can be put in place that would encourage them to come and partner with local institutions and to provide more to meet the demand for high levels of skills. I think there are opportunities to build on what is already working in India. The successes at the bottom of the pyramid, the community-based approaches to micro-lending, the leveraging of world-class investment in foreign direct investment in areas like IT and biotech and BPO. Why not do the same thing in education to the benefit of India and these institutions? The diffusion of cheap IT, the knowledge kiosks in the villages, the fact that Nindan Melkani is now working to create an electronic ID number for every citizen, offers new opportunities for reforming the system. Big emphasis on public-private partnerships at all levels of the system, and models like I met last week with Mr. Pawar, the founder of NIIT. A very interesting example of a non-government organization that built a highly recognized qualification that has real currency in the labor market and has trained hundreds of thousands of people as a result, and now applying that same philosophy to trying to educate the urban poor through the holes in the wall and giving them access to computers. Likewise, leveraging the leading corporations that are investing in training and creating new freedom for higher education institutions to raise and keep private funds. So in the past, where people might have been discouraged from giving because if they gave a big gift, the government would take that money away from the rest of the budget. Now they've said, no, if you can raise additional resources like we do to build endowments in the US, you can keep that as additional money to raise the quality of your institution, to provide scholarships and whatnot. So some promising examples. I would recommend to you all the book called The Beautiful Tree. Oh, go back. Sorry. Go back. Sorry, forward one. Forward two more. Forward, please. Other way. Other way. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Okay. So these were the schools I was referring to in India. Unfortunately, on the left side there's meant to be a video clip. My son Sam took it when we visited over the weekend. These are schools that I referred to, private schools right here in Hyderabad, literally hundreds of them, providing education to the rural poor with no other subsidies, right? And they're providing a form of learning that we're not seeing in the other schools. And active learning, the video shows children who are jumping up and down, singing English to songs so that they are actually not just memorizing, but really learning and speaking the content, right? Also getting them the juices flowing, getting the energy so that they are more awake for the rest of their classes. And we're seeing very strong results from these schools with very limited budgets. And so do they provide a potential basis for mass education, both in the cities and rural areas? Likewise, I think very promising development from the ITIs, the vocational training institutions. The government has recognized that the system wasn't working and now said, we want to reform them by getting industry to adopt them, which will both make the training, the curriculum more relevant, more modular, to give them more flexibility, and provide what young people are looking for, an opportunity for a job at the end of the training, because they will be meeting employers' needs. And we have seen across the country examples where this new model appears to be working quite well. One of the areas for study that we would like to do in our project is to compare the performance of these new reformed ITIs with the others to show that this model makes a big difference. So I wanted to finish up with suggesting a potential model for dealing with perhaps the biggest challenge facing the India skills system. How to provide a good level of basic skills and education to the vast majority of the population. And what I've got here is sort of an amalgam of many things that are already going on within India. The proposal for an integrated learning center or knowledge center within villages, where you would, during the day, have a charter school, a school where the local community would have the budget, whether it was the local village council, or whether it was perhaps these peer lending groups for micro-lending. You would give them the resource, they could choose their provider. And you would combine a school during the day with a skills center at night, weekends, during the holidays, that could train the parents, could train the workers who missed educational opportunity. And in that same location, concentrate the rural development, the opportunities to grow new enterprises and jobs, food processing, BPO, other opportunities that could keep people in the village and create job opportunities there. Next highest level of qualification, but who receive intensive ongoing development every month, further training, linking them by the internet so they can get mentoring and support when they don't know a problem, sending them in the breaks to even more training so that you actually have a workforce that's turning up every day in the villages to a locally accountable board. There's also, I think, great opportunities to leverage new IT, to teach classes through Skype, to teach classes using the hole-in-the-wall model. I suggested to NIIT that they might think about an open source learning competition. One of the challenges is so many different languages in India. We'll go to this huge IT workforce you have and say, we will give $1 million rupees to the best 10-minute modules, animated modules to teach the different core competencies that we need for the children. You don't pay everybody, you just offer it as an award and you encourage the same thing that's happened with Linux, with other open source systems to occur. These models that I'm talking about rely much more heavily on the market than the current system, but there are still many key roles for government. I think the government has to ensure universal access to education, but it has to separate what it has thought in the past, which means the government must provide it, to the government must enable it. It can provide the resources, it can monitor the performance through outcomes, not through inspectors turning up and saying, are you doing this, do you have this, but rather, are you bringing the students in, are you keeping them, are you lowering dropout, are you producing the performance? It needs to promote diversity and inclusiveness, to diffuse innovations. There are so many exciting things going on across India, but they're in small pockets. To diffuse this so those models that work can be scaled to meet this huge challenge. And finally, to invest in the enabling infrastructure you need to make this work. IT, connectivity, and having a strong and motivated, qualified teaching workforce. So the final slide, just to conclude. I think there are a huge number of wonderful reform ideas already contained in the Knowledge Commission's report, in the Yashpal report. The challenge is going to be implementation and getting these passed. Some other policy options which we could talk about in questions if you want. We have some interesting examples in New Jersey of career academies, which are figured out how to not only deliver very high quality vocational education, but to actually get better academic results than the best academic schools. Because the students are learning on biotechnology or robotics, and they are so excited by applying it that they are also learning very strongly in science, in English, math, and their other subjects. Likewise, I think there are many opportunities to expand and broaden the career options, particularly for women, from the traditional ones to many more opportunities. We visited a women's polytechnic in Jaipur where they're doing a wonderful job, but only in the traditional occupations that women would go into. So they train them for office work, but not to be software programmers, not to be IT systems integrators. And so I think thinking about how you might broaden those opportunities will be vital. And then finally, I think a core task for institutes like this is how do we develop the cadre of change agents, the people like yourselves who will go out into these enterprises and implement these ideas and make them a reality. Thank you very much.
You have heard Dr. Finegold, and I would like the floor to open now. Any questions on the topic that you have heard from him? Yes?
Offshoring is one of your, is your interest in research field. Okay, now US President Mr. Obama is planning to cut off this outsourcing things to India. So what he is planning, he is literally forcing the companies to do so. This is a different issue that the companies are willing to do it or not. Why is it like this? During the boom time, US companies went to India, and during the crisis time, you are planning to cut off the outsourcing. So why is it so? And secondly, does he have any plans to accommodate both? Wherein he can accommodate his plans and also does not harm India?
I think the relations between this new administration and the US are off in most areas to an extremely promising start. I think the one hiccup potentially is what you point to around the issues of protectionism. I think that this has been a little bit overblown in the press. So it's important to distinguish between the vast majority of offshoring, which has absolutely nothing to do with the government, and is not going to stop. They're not telling the IT firms you can't do it. They're not telling the pharma firms you can't do it. The issue is around the stimulus dollars that the government is spending because of that high unemployment rate I talked about. And should those stimulus dollars, which are intended to create jobs for workers here, workers in the US, should those dollars be allowed to be spent in India? So as an analogy, you think about your rural employment scheme. How would Indians feel if the money from the rural employment scheme went to farmers in Iowa? Or Nebraska? Now, the wealth is very different, yes. But I think you need to draw a distinction between where the government is spending money specifically to deal with a crisis and create jobs, and the broader system, which is really, I firmly believe, this administration is not interested in protectionism. In fact, they are very worried about what China is doing, where a much stronger emphasis on saying only the jobs can be created in China, and you're not allowed anymore to partner or spend any of this with international funds.
Good afternoon, Professor. As you know that Indian government expanding, like number of IITs and IIMs have been incorporated from this year. So please comment on that. Don't you think that will be affecting the quality of engineers or management graduates coming out of that in a long run? After all, we don't see many Harvards or many Stanfords. It's only one, right? So please comment on that.